So it is truly an honor to get to introduce you to our next guest. Now I'm excited. I think you'll be excited too. One of the most cited public intellectuals of our time, Professor Emeritus at MIT, historian, author, political activist, scholar, Noam Chomsky. Great to have you, Professor. So great to speak with you.
Glad to be with you.
So there's so many things that we could talk about, but I was wondering if you could start by putting this moment that we're all living through in a little bit of context. I mean, we have this unbelievable pandemic. We have racial unrest and uprisings across the country. We have a Great Depression. We have the existential threat of climate change and so many more things that we're living through right now. How does this compare to other things that you've lived through or that you've studied? Help us put this in context.
This is a unique moment in history, in human history, not just my lifetime. We're living at a point of confluence of severe crises. There's another one that you didn't mention, equally severe, the increasing threat of terminal nuclear war. So nuclear war, destruction of the environment, raging pandemic, others likely to come unless we prepare for them, innumerable problems internal to the country. There's never been a moment in human history where such a confluence of crises emerged, and the decisions about them have to be made very soon. They cannot be delayed. Nuclear war could break out at any time. We've lived under the shadow of nuclear war for 75 years. Those familiar with the record must be aware that it's a near miracle that we've escaped. President Trump is systematically dismantling the protections that offered some defense against nuclear war. The leading experts like William Perry, former Secretary of Defense, a person not given to exaggeration, very conservative and very well informed about these issues, argues that the threat is now greater than during the Cold War, when it was extremely dangerous. Environmental catastrophe is approaching. We will emerge somehow from the pandemic at terrible cost, mostly needless cost, particularly in countries like the United States, which are off the international spectrum in efforts to control it. But we will emerge. We will not emerge from the melting of the polar ice sheets. That's permanent. It's going to have a permanent effect. We can go on. But there are a few decades left in which we can make a decision as to whether organized human life will survive on Earth or will succumb to the threat of environmental disaster. Again, the United States under President Trump is virtually alone in the world in pushing the accelerator to race to disaster. Other countries are doing at least something, not enough, but something. The United States, along with a few outliers elsewhere, is trying to escalate the crisis. The pandemic is severe, much worse here than in most other countries. Take a look back at, say, late March of this year. The United States and Europe were comparable, almost identical in level of cases and deaths. Since then, the curve for Europe has gone way down. Many countries are opening up, partially opening up. The pandemic is more or less under control. In the United States, it's gotten worse, curves up. And there are other countries that are doing much better. Countries of East Asia, Oceania, New Zealand, Australia, South Korea, Taiwan, much better. So it can be dealt with. But furthermore, apart from this pandemic, we can be pretty confident that others are going to come. Scientists who've been warning about this one for years, the overwhelming majority of them, are now warning that others more severe may come unless we prepare for them, and those preparations are not being made. Then there are the internal problems inside the country. So we are at a unique moment. Either we will decide, all of those decisions will be made in a few weeks, but within the next decade or two, we will decide whether our grandchildren will have a world in which human beings can survive. There's never been a moment in history when those decisions have to be made. So yes, this moment is unique.
And with the pandemic, I mean, this has hit, no one's been exempt, right? Not here, not around the world. And so we've kind of had a real-time test of which countries were able to effectively deal with this and best protect their citizens and which weren't. And as you accurately point out, the United States has utterly failed on this measurement, both in terms of keeping citizens safe from illness and death, but also in terms of protecting their economic well-being during this period. A lot of people have started to use the term failed state just because there's been such a failure on every level of government response, starting, of course, at the White House with President Trump. Do you think that that's an accurate characterization of what we're seeing here?
Well, if we want to characterize what we're seeing and we want to prevent the next pandemic, I assume we want to prevent it now. We have to ask why we're having a pandemic altogether. Very serious question. You should think about it and look at it closely. So in 2003, there was a SARS epidemic. That's another coronavirus. It was contained. The scientists knew at the time that another one was coming. They warned about it, said you got to get prepared for it. Explained how to get prepared for it. Same things that are being said now. The knowledge was there. Actions weren't taken. Who could take the actions? Well, the group that comes to mind is the drug companies. They have huge profits, wonderful laboratories, but they're blocked. They're blocked by something called capitalist logic, which says your goal is to make profits tomorrow, not to prepare for something a couple of years down the road, which you won't make that much profit from anyway. Vaccine you use once, so you want to do things that will sell and make them tomorrow. So they're out. The other possibility is the government. Again, enormous resources, wonderful laboratories, but they're blocked by something called neoliberalism. You may recall when Ronald Reagan was inaugurated 40 years ago, a speech famously said that government is the problem, not the solution. Translating that into English, it means decisions have to be taken out of the hands of government, which is partially responsive to popular citizens, to its own citizens, placed in the hands of private, unaccountable enterprises, which you can have no effect on. So that's the world has been suffering under that for 40 years in many ways. One of the ways is government was blocked from picking up the ball and running with it. Well, there still were things you could do. But when President Obama was elected, his first few days in office, he called a meeting of the Presidential Scientific Advisory Council, asked for it, set up by H.W. Bush, first Bush, and asked them to prepare a pandemic preparation program. Came back a couple of weeks later with a detailed program as to how to deal with a pandemic when it arrives. It was put into place. There were programs of American scientists working with Chinese colleagues to discover and study new coronaviruses all over. They proliferate in caves in China, dangerous, important work. There were simulations undertaken of what to do in case of strike. Some of these were as late as October 2019. So there at least was something in place, not enough. Okay, then came January 2017. President Trump came into office. First few days in office, he dismantled the whole system, finished it, and started moving to end the programs with U.S. scientists working with Chinese colleagues. He began to try to defund the Center for Disease Control and other health-related components of government. Every year's budget was tried to do the same. The most recent one was February 2020. This February, pandemic is raging. Budget proposal comes from the White House. Cut back more on the Center for Disease Control and other health-related components of government. The United States was singularly unprepared. On January 10th, the Chinese government released the Chinese scientists had discovered the source of the epidemic, identified the virus, sequenced the genome, presented the information to the entire world through the World Health Organization. The countries that cared about their citizens acted. East Asia and Oceania, mostly from South Korea to Vietnam, New Zealand, Australia, acted very quickly and have the situation very much under control, as China itself pretty much does. Europe delayed somewhat, but then got into the act, began to work. Germany, Norway, others have the situation pretty much under control. Even Italy, which had a huge pandemic, has now gotten it under control. Then there's the United States. Nothing. U.S. intelligence was trying to get information to the White House, warning them of what was happening, with no interest. The answer was to defund the Center for Disease Control. And finally, in March, Trump took notice, probably because the stock market was declining. Then, since then, it's been chaotic, one thing after another. Fire the chief scientist in charge of vaccine creation right in the midst of the pandemic. Fire him because he said some things that Trump didn't like about one of his black medicines. Pass the responsibility to the states if they don't have the resources that come from the federal government. But let the states take responsibility. So therefore, if anything goes wrong, I can blame someone else. And if something by accident works, I can take credit for it. That's the reason. Break up the programs that are working with Chinese scientists because it's necessary to try to cast blame on someone else for the tragedy of killing by now about 175,000 Americans. It means we can see this from other countries. Have to blame someone else. So blame the World Health Organization. Let's destroy them. Kill lots of people in Africa, Yemen, and others who rely on the World Health Organization for survival from many diseases. So let's blame them and destroy it and kill those people. But then let's blame China. China is not free of blame, but they did give the information quickly. Everyone knew about it. And now they have the situation pretty much under control. So let's blame them. Blame anybody, as long as it deflects attention from the villains who are responsible, right in the White House. That's what we're living with. And if we decide we want to live with this for another 4 years, maybe too late to run it. Already there are indications that in the articles in Science Journal saying that perhaps Greenland, which has a huge quantity of ice, perhaps Greenland, ice melting in Greenland is moving towards a tipping point where it will be irreversible. Antarctica will be ice vastly more even than the Arctic. Glaciers are beginning to calve, split off the water. You can see the effects in the weather system right now in Louisiana, Bangladesh, for a while, a third of the country is underwater, increasing intensity of storms, hurricanes, wildfires. events exactly as predicted, with the global heating taking place, and we'll get much worse, almost certainly. And we can decide, do we want to live with that for as long as human society can survive? Not very long under these conditions. Or do
Yeah.
we want to live? There are ways to deal with every single one of these problems well within our capacity, but they have to be done effectively, which could have been prevented.
Professor, I wanted to ask you about the future of the American left. Obviously, many were demoralized by Bernie Sanders' second loss this time around. And so there's this open debate about what the right path is for. Do you try again to have this sort of political revolution within the Democratic Party to kick out the neoliberals? Do you start an entirely new third party? There's a new effort underway with the People's Party to start something new, working class focused from scratch. Which way do you think is the most likely to succeed? And then do you think that it's possible to influence and move a Biden administration if he does, in fact, win the presidency?
All we can say is that, assuming he's elected, it better be possible, or else we're in serious trouble. But yes, I think it is possible. In fact, we've seen evidence of it already. The slogan that I think we should hold up and follow is get rid of the Trump malignancy, which will destroy us, and then challenge the Democratic Party establishment, challenge Biden, keep their feet to the fire, popular pressure, popular activism, the engagement of the Sanders movement and popular groups like Sunrise Movement in the planning of the program have in fact shifted the Democratic Party program will towards what's called here the left, social democratic side, farther than any previous any presidential candidate in recent memory, way beyond Clinton or Obama. Now the point is, can you keep their feet to the fire? Can you continue with the pressures and the activism that has forced them to move to the left? The DNC, the Democratic National Committee, they don't like it. They're trying to block it. They're Clintonite neoliberals, more or less what used to be called moderate Republicans, before the Republican Party went way off the spectrum. And they don't like it, and we can see it. So, for example, both Biden and Kamala Harris had called for an end to subsidies for fossil fuel industries. The DNC canceled. They don't want that. They don't want to alienate the donor class. And these struggles will continue. So the question that you ask, you don't know the answer. The answer is in the hands of people like you. Are you going to keep pressing them to do what they ought to do? Or will we let them go the way that private power will drive them? The whole question rises all the time. There's no prediction. It's a matter of action, not speculation. It can be moved. We've seen it. We've seen it before in the past. I'm old enough to remember pretty well the Great Depression, 1929. It devastating. Took a couple. The labor movement had been crushed in the 1920s, mostly by Woodrow Wilson's Red Scare. There's nothing there. Took a couple of years, finally revived. In 1934, the CIO organizing labor actions, lots of other political actions, fairly sympathetic administration, and it was possible to get things in hand to establish the systems that we've benefited from ever since, ranging from things like the TVA, Tennessee Valley Authority, which greatly improved the lives of people in Appalachia and still does, ranging from that to Social Security, to pensions, to workers' rights, to some degree, not enough, but some. But anyway, had it kind of under control. We had lived under that system. plenty of flaws, lots wrong with it, but fairly decent until 40 years ago, when the neoliberal assault began with quite predictable results. When you shift power into the hands of private decision, corporate sector makes their own rules, their goals, maximize profit. Their concern is not the welfare of the population.
Well, Professor, thank you so much for giving us so much of your time today. I'm truly honored to get to speak with you, and we really, really are grateful for you, your thoughts, and your time.
Thank you.
We'll have more Rising for you after this.